Have you ever planned out a dungeon, laid out all of the rooms, you know where every monster is going to be located, you've balanced all of the encounters for your party, and then you think, oh crap, I haven't placed any traps. If you're pressed for time, maybe you'll just add some token traps into the connecting corridors, relying on the classics, swinging axes, poison darts, or maybe a rolling boulder. But as DMs, why do we do this? Is it because we still have this idea of the old school dungeon and putting in these kinds of traps? Maybe, but I think there's a real game design reason for why traps are important in D&D. And it's not just as a distraction for the players, it's all about resource management. As the DM, your goal when you introduce a trap should always be to drain the party's resources before the next fight or encounter. And what do we mean here by resources? Well, it's not just hit points. Well-designed encounters including traps can cause the party to use up spell slots, their race or class features, as well as consumable or limited use items like potions, for example. So, how can we do this effectively and in a way where players don't get bored of the same arrow slit trap in every dungeon? Let's talk through my 6 quick tips for running great traps in D&D. Number 1. Think about why the trap is there. Is it a natural feature? Maybe a weak stalactite on the ceiling of a cave that might just fall when it's disturbed? Or is the trap artificial, something that was made, constructed, placed intentionally by another creature? Most traps we use in D&D probably fall into that second camp, which is why it's so important to work out who laid the trap and why they did it. In most circumstances, this is probably to protect their home, protect their master, or protect some treasure or other valuable item or location. So the motivation for a lot of monsters and villains in D&D is pretty clear in terms of why they would lay down a trap. Then start to think about who placed it. Working that out will give you a feel for how the trap should work, how it might look, and how its features may interact with the players as they come across it. For example, let's say you have a cave full of orcs. Orcs are generally on the lower end of the intelligence scale and they live a kind of nomadic lifestyle. So traps that orcs lay down are probably going to be similar to traps that they might use while out hunting. Things like snare traps, pits, cages and nets, etc. Kobolds, on the other hand, are known for their ingenuity and we know they also like to use burrows. So I imagine kobold traps involving ditches, pits and other earthworks, and maybe then including things like falling boulders or collapsing tunnels. What you don't want to do when you're planning out your dungeon is just throw in some traps into an area where it doesn't really make any sense for them to be there. For example, a swinging axes style trap in the lair of a creature that would never be able to build something of that level of complexity. Let's say you've got a dungeon full of oozes and umber hulks. The only kind of traps you'll get there are likely to be natural ones, unless those creatures are just inhabiting an older structure that once belonged to somebody else, and some of those older traps are still functional. Whatever the case, make sure at least you as the DM understand how the trap got there in the first place. Number 2. Choose the right location for the trap. If you have a trap right at the front door of a dungeon and it's not really near any combat encounters or isn't in a particularly dangerous place, and all it does is deal some damage to the party, then it hasn't really done its job as a trap. Hit points can be recovered on a short or long rest, and if there is no immediate danger, then the trap hasn't been very effective in draining the party's resources, as they can just rest to recover their hit points. Traps are usually better placed deeper into a dungeon, maybe between 2 combat encounters, or placed in such a way that triggering the trap also alerts the nearby monsters. So the sequence of events is from the trap straight into initiative, with no chance to rest or recuperate in between. Equally, having a trap that deals damage at the very end of a dungeon or on the way out of a dungeon is pretty pointless, as the party are probably on their way out to go and take a long rest anyway. A really common place for a trap, and I do this a lot as a DM too, is to trap the treasure room, which is usually the last room the party will find. Now, while this may make a lot of narrative sense for the bad guys to place a trap here, it doesn't really do its job as a D&D trap. because again, whatever resources it drains are about to be regained anyway once they leave the dungeon. So put traps on your treasure room if you like, as it does make logical sense for the bad guys to do this, but just make sure your main trap designing focus and effort is placed elsewhere. Number 3. Track character positioning and make a note of their passive perception scores. This can be tricky outside of initiative order and without a map to place character tokens on, but it is very important when running traps. For example, if a tripwire is going to subject the first person that walks into it to some horrible effect, then everyone at the table needs to know who is in front and who is going to hit that tripwire first. If positioning isn't clearly communicated, you will always get that player or two that will try and debate their position after the fact. They'll say, oh, I wouldn't have been at the front because I have my bow drawn, or I didn't want to be standing so close to the barbarian, etc. And they're saying these things to try and avoid whatever trap you've already told them has been triggered. So, whenever the party are exploring a potentially dangerous place, always ask for that marching order. Even if you don't have a map for the particular location that the party are in, just ask them to place their minis on the table to show their relative positioning to each other. And if you're playing online, this is even easier to just use their virtual tokens to show where they are. Then, unless a player explicitly asks to break that marching order formation as they move through the area, you as the DM have a good idea of who is going to hit what traps. Even if you play purely in the theatre of the mind, it's still good to ask the players to think about their positioning, so you've at least got a basic idea of who is where. One thing you don't want to do though is only ask for a marching order when you know a trap is about to come up, as the players will get wise to this and they'll start to metagame. They'll just assume every time you ask for a marching order something bad is about to happen, in which case everyone's probably going to want to stand at the back. Get into the habit of asking for a marching order whenever there is the potential for danger, not only when there is definite danger ahead. If you've learned something in this video so far, you would help me out a lot by hitting that like button. Not only does this tell me what kind of content you guys want to see in my videos, but it also helps to boost the channel. And remember, you can subscribe to the channel Nazir North to make sure you don't miss out on more videos like this in the future. Okay, let's go back to traps. Number 4. Mix and match triggers and effects to create new and unique traps. When laying a trap, there are two different components that you need to think about. There is the trigger, so what has to happen for the trap to be set off, and then there is the effect, or the trap itself, so what happens after the triggering conditions have been met. Now, a trigger could be mechanical or magical in nature. A mechanical trigger can be something like a tripwire, a pressure plate, or a lever, button, or switch of some kind. Whereas a magical trigger can be pretty much anything that you can imagine as the DM, ranging from a motion detector to a glyph that only triggers when a certain type of creature moves past it, for example. And then for the trap itself, you have almost an infinite number of different options to try and deal damage to the players or to drain their resources in other and more creative ways. Some trap effects can be very simple, for example ones that just deal direct damage like an arrow trap. Some can cast a spell or impose a condition of some kind, maybe a poisonous gas, a sleep dart, or a petrification ray. Some traps can be far more complex. If you have a look in the Dungeon Master's Guide section on traps, and in particular the section on traps included in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, there are guidelines on building and running traps that act in initiative order, a bit like a monster, and some of them have multiple effects that trigger at different points in a normal 6-second round of combat. To get the most out of your prep time as a DM, you can reuse and recycle all these different trap effects and triggers that you come up with again and again. So to get unique traps each time you build a dungeon, just reuse and shift around the triggers and effects you've used before, so it doesn't just feel like you're copying and pasting the same traps into every dungeon. Number 5. Integrate monsters into your traps and use traps in combat. Traps don't just have to be objects and hazards for the party to run into in between combat encounters. You can add them directly to your battle maps. If you're dealing with smart foes, really anything with an intelligence of around 7 or above, give them some traps in their lair that they can use during a fight. Maybe some kobolds have rocks held up in a shelf near the ceiling of a cavern that they can then release by pulling on a rope. That could be a free object interaction in initiative. Or maybe some bandits have flasks of alchemist's fire loaded into slingshots hidden behind a curtain. They could then launch these by cutting a triggering wire. Just bear in mind that having high damage traps or traps that impose conditions will increase the difficulty of your combat encounter, so factor that in alongside the challenge ratings of the monsters that you're using. And when coming up with these ideas, just try and put yourselves into the shoes of the bad guys. How would you defend your home? What tools and materials or magic do you have access to create traps and hazards to fend off invaders? And last one, number 6. Get creative, experiment, and don't be afraid to borrow and steal ideas from elsewhere. Movies and video games provide great inspiration for many aspects of campaign building in D&D, but they can also help generate ideas for new traps. Next time you're watching something that is maybe fantasy or sci-fi, pay particular attention to the environment. What hazards do the protagonists have to work their way around? What kind of obstacles are they facing? And the same goes for video games too. If you're playing an RPG that involves dungeon crawling in some way, take note of the kind of traps used and see if you can adapt them for your tabletop game. And the other really obvious source to look for when you want to borrow traps from elsewhere is official adventure books or third-party published adventure books. Their dungeon plans and layouts will often include incredible trap ideas that you can borrow and adapt or just straight copy into your campaign. If you'd like to see my written guide on trap building, which includes 12 original traps of my own design that you can use in your games, you can get this for free via the Reddit link in the description below. Then there is also a load more content just like this on my newly released Patreon page, so check that out too if you're interested. Cheers for watching, I'll see you in the next video.